Welcome to the Street Smart Wisdom Podcast from Wisdom Feed. I'm Steve Stein. In this series, we talk to best-selling authors and thought leaders doing great work in the world of mindfulness, wellness, and creativity. Our mission is to bring ancient ideas down to street level and bring you takeaways that you can apply to everyday life. Enjoy. This podcast is sponsored by BetterListen.com. At BetterListen, we have hundreds of audios, courses, and programs available to stream and download. As a listener to the Street Smart Wisdom Podcast, you are eligible for a free audiobook download. Just visit BetterListen.com/free today. On this show, our guest is the iconic thinker and cultural historian, William Irwin Thompson. In this conversation, we discuss the arc and evolution of his distinguished career.
I go way back to the 1950s beginning of all this with Yogananda. My first beginning was I was a high school student at LA High, and I went to a lecture in the streets of just what is now Koreatown in LA, and heard a brother Bhaktananda who was part of the Self-Realization Fellowship. And he emanated a kind of mindfulness and peace that I'd never encountered with a teacher. I mean, he really embodied what he was talking about, and he had a sense of presence where all the other high school teachers and people I had met were mental, busy energy. And I was really impressed, and so I became aware of SRF and Yogananda bringing yoga from India, in the first wave, way back in the 20s or something. So growing up in the streets of LA being a city on the Pacific Rim, interfacing with all of those Asian cultures from Japan and China, I became aware of the waves of planetization. And
what's that word, planetization?
Planetization is a word from Teilhard de Chardin,
right?
Book on the Future of Mankind. And so the planetization was something I bumped into because I was growing up in a big urban environment on the Pacific Rim. So I didn't come at it from Brooklyn or New York. I got it from LA, but this is LA in the 50s when it was the Marilyn Monroe top-down convertible Santa Monica Beach era. So it was, being at the right place at the right time. And so that made a big impression on me. And I started reading the Upanishads and stuff in high school and getting really interested. And then went, get busy on the academic thing and took a right turn into getting a BA and PhD at Pomona and then Cornell. And then finally, when I got back to Cambridge and teaching at M.I.T, then I had time to take a left turn back to esoteric matters. And so I went to the SRF ashram and the beautiful lake out in Malibu on Sunset Boulevard, and then started taking the Kriya Yoga lessons of Yogananda. That's a 3.5-year course in traditional Shaivite, esoteric yoga. And it's pretty much what, a lot of people teach, the elevation of Kundalini, the initiation through the etheric body. So it's illumination, not enlightenment. It's definitely using the etheric body as the vehicle of initiation, which from a, let's say, Buddhist or even Catholic point of view, that's not compassion, that's not enlightenment, that's not, the biggie, it's just illumination. And so those people who stop there can be spiritually arrogant, spiritually cruel. Then they're definitely not there yet. And that's why a lot of the gurus were screwed up. I had then in the 60s, I met Muktananda, and he was messing around with women, and he was doing Shaktipat. And all of that stuff doesn't mean shit, it's all the etheric body. But a lot of people, thought it stopped there and made a big deal out of Muktananda. And, Trungpa was doing his thing, and there was a lot of noise I met Trungpa, so I met a lot of these guys. And some of them were really screwed up, like Trungpa was an alcoholic, and people would talk about crazy wisdom, and they would rationalize to hold on to their holy man. But the holy man was more noise than information, so I was very unsatisfied with that.
More noise than information. What does that mean?
Well, that's information theory from Shannon, that a message is information plus noise in the signal. So if you have a muddy channel, then you have more noise than information. If you have a good, clear channel, then you have more information than noise.
Right. I like that metaphor because, it is relevant to everyday people could understand that. And I think I want to hear more about your process, but I think there's a lot of noise in today's society, and we can talk about that a little later. I actually got Shaktipat from Yogananda the last weekend he was in the U.S. upstate.
Yeah, I got it on the Upper East Side with Ira Friedlander, the guy who wrote the book on the whirling dervishes, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. When I'm at M.I.T. and it's the 60s, and the counterculture is really happening. And I was never into drugs, but my friends, and I've never owned a nickel bag or owned a joint. I accepted a roach at parties in the 60s. I think I smoked grass twice. And that was just tokes. So I took a toke and I had my head in the stereo speaker, listening to the Doors, break on through to the other side. And then my third eye started swirling with this vortex. And a voice came in and said, "Get the hell out of here, you drugstore mystic, and come in the right way." And so I, listened to that daimonic prompting and would have nothing to do with the counterculture drug scene. I met Alpert and what was his name change? Dick Albert. Dick Albert became what? He had
Ram Dass.
Yeah, Ram Dass. I met him. I went to a lecture in the East Village, I think, with Timothy Leary. And I was really turned off by the scene, by him, by their vibes. And I had a repulsion to the psychedelic subculture. I didn't want any part of it. And because I had been exposed as a high school student back circling to Brother Bhaktinanda, I began to be interested in, pure yoga and doing it the right way as the voice instructed. So when I was out in LA, when I was still teaching at MIT, I went for a walk around the Self-Realization Fellowship Lake in Malibu or whatever part of LA it's in. And from that, connected to the Kriya Yoga and started doing Kriya Yoga, which takes 3.5 years to go through the whole trip. And that got me really interested in the authentic counterculture and not the druggy one. So when
Was there overlapping between the authentic counterculture and the druggy one?
No, there was just repulsion to the drug scene and even grass for me. I always had a daimonic feeling that LSD, my friends were doing acid. and STP and some other stuff and mushrooms. And I knew sort of intuitively that that was not the way I wanted to go. So I went into the yogic training. And then that practice of doing that, I came to, the usual countercultural crisis of MIT with the Vietnam War, and became dissatisfied that MIT was like the thought police of the military industrial complex, and being an MIT professor was like being Muzak in the factory. And so I quit, even though they promoted me twice in the 3 years I was there. And I actually now think it was a mistake. I should have stayed at MIT. But I went up to this brand new university in Toronto called York University, which was supposed to become the Santa Cruz of Canada, but it never did. But in the very first days in 1968, it was full of promise and idealism,
wow.
Innovation, and we were, and so I was part of that. And then when I was in Canada, I went to the summer conferences of the Canadians called the Couchiching Conference on Lake Couchiching one summer, maybe 69. And I met Ivan Illich, and he blew me away. He was the most charismatic speaker I'd ever heard. And this one was when Ivan was really hot. He was writing Deschooling Society and all these articles for the New York Review of Books. And he articulated with his CDOC the countercultural institution, the individual as institute. So I wrote a cover article for Harper with that title, The Individual as Institution, and looked at these various people who had split from the scene and set up their own shop, and I decided that was the way I wanted to go. So I quit the university and set up Lindisfarne and came down from Toronto to Manhattan, first setting it up in the Hamptons and then moving to the church on the corner of 6th, in the 70s, on the corner of 6th Avenue and 20th Street.
Our friends at Better Listen are offering a special discount to listeners of the show. 20% off all programs at betterlisten.com. Just use discount code podcast20 when checking out. Enjoy. So when was that you set up shop in Manhattan?
I moved, I think in 1973, down and had the first to Southampton, the Hamptons, and had the first Lindisfarne conference that brought all these diverse people who expressed planetization together. So I had E.F. Schumacher and Stuart Brand and Carl Sagan, and I had about 20 of those guys. So it was a big scene, and so it got an article in the New York Times Sunday Magazine, and Bill Moyers did an hour TV program on me in Lindisfarne. That was Lindisfarne and Manhattan, but the first, from 74 to 76, we were out in the Hamptons. In 1976, we got the property in Manhattan. It was an underused church that had died. It was, the church in which the Easter parade first happened in Manhattan. So at one time, it was the scene, but that era had passed and it was left, and the Episcopal Church wanted to get rid of it because it was a drain on them, so we got it for $1 a year lease.
Wow.
Yeah. And Chelsea, of course, boomed later. If I could have stayed in Manhattan and kept that scene and had the Conference Center in the Hamptons and the Urban Center in Manhattan, that would have been perfect. But that takes a lot of money.
Well, I was wondering how you pulled it off, but $1 a year, I mean, that's affordable.
Yeah, that's affordable, but the program to run it, I had at the beginning grants from the Lilly Endowment, Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Lawrence Rockefeller came to one of my lectures at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. It might have been the one you were in. So the Village Voice wrote an article about, hey, get your lifestyle, and talked about hippies and Rockefeller as, in the same audience listening to me. And Lawrence invited me to lunch next day. and said, would you like some money? And so he became my patron. And so with that money, I started my program. But eventually in Manhattan, you get $50,000, you spend it on the programs, and you're broke, So they don't give you money for an endowment because they don't want to have a dependent. There are rules that the rich have about their philanthropy. And the number one rule is don't make dependents. Just give them to empower them and then back off. And so they did that. And with it, I had, a very dynamic program for 3 years, and then it went bust.
Right. And then I remember I recorded you up at Synod House, and
yeah,
that must have been, I didn't graduate college till the 80s. So it must have been like 83, 84, 82.
Oh, that's much later. Yeah. Because during the time, Jim Morton got interested because when he became dean in 75, he had grown up in the Black South civil rights movement when his white elitist class, tried to help the afflicted blacks in the South and in the civil rights movement. And so with the environmental movement, though he became Green Dean, he hadn't a clue about ecology. And suddenly he comes to my meetings out in the Hamptons, and he meets John Todd, and he meets, all these ecologists and appropriate technology people, and gets totally turned on by that. And when I look at the group, I realize that I needed to make it more permanent, so I created the Lindisfarne Fellows. And I think he became a Lindisfarne Fellow in 75, and then he invited me to become an honorary colleague, which is like the secular equivalent of being a canon. Since I wasn't a clergyman, I couldn't be a canon. And so he and the Bishop Paul Moore made me an honorary colleague of the cathedral, and I started giving a course of lectures that you attended in the 80s.
Yeah, we recorded them. We did the audio recordings, and I think it was David Spangler and...
Yeah, a whole bunch of people, yeah. Yeah, and so that was in the 80s, and I, since I couldn't, I was no longer in Canada, I couldn't afford to live in Manhattan because it's just so expensive.
So expensive.
Yeah, and so I was living in Bern with my Swiss wife and commuting to do a season of talks at the cathedral, and that worked for a couple of years. And like everything, to everything there is a season, and so that was my season at the cathedral. Now there's a new dean, and I have absolutely nothing to do with it.
Right. You've been listening to Street Smart Wisdom, the podcast from Wisdom Feed. You can follow Wisdom Feed on Facebook, Twitter, and iTunes. If you haven't, please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast on iTunes. We appreciate your feedback. Join us next week for another Street Smart conversation. Thank you for listening.